Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome. Courtney and I decided to team preach this sermon, selfishly, partially because she's only with us a few more weeks and I just wanted to spend more time with her, but also because this passage this morning is very special. There are two people interacting with Christ and we wanted to each represent different people. So that's where we are. For those of you who are new, we are spending the whole year walking through Exodus and Mark, enjoying a conversation between the Old Testament and the Gospels. And as we're in Mark this week, the question that we come to Mark with every week, every passage is, who is this man? Who is this Jesus of Nazareth? We've seen him heal. He has power over bodies and sickness. We've seen him bring in outsiders to the center, and then we've seen him confound the insiders and take them to the outside. In the last chapter, we've seen his power over nature when he calmed the storm. Remember the disciples, don't you care if we're going to die? And him speaking, peace, be still. And they say, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Then we see him on the other side of the water. Pastor Gary brought us a word to when the man who was roaming through the tombs and just tortured his power over the spiritual realm.
And this morning we pick up this story as Jesus and the disciples make their way back across the Sea of Galilee. And the distance there would be about the distance from Weed Beach down in Darien over to Long Island. So you can imagine how far that is. They would be journeying their way back. And today we see Jesus encounter two people, two women. One is a woman or a girl who is 12 years old. The other is a woman who's been suffering for 12 years. So it made us think about 12 years ago. We had to do some math. 2012. Where were you in June of 2012? What were you doing? I was graduating high school in June of 2012 at the risk of taking away all of my credibility. So it made us think 12 years is a long time, right? A lot happens in 12 years. So we'll think more about that together today.
And what we're going to do is we're going to take an unhurried walk through Mark, the second half of Mark chapter 5. And after that unhurried walk, each one of us has a different takeaway. So hopefully you will hear Christ through our voices this morning. Let's pray. Lord, we come around your word with great expectation. We know that you have something for us in it. Help us to hear you. Help us to respond to you. Amen. All right. We are in Mark chapter 5. We're going to start at verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. And then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. This man, Jairus, who's this man? This man is esteemed. He's honored. He's been given a place of authority in the community, and we learned this week in our research that it's very likely that the synagogue leaders were also Pharisees. And how did the Pharisees respond to Jesus? Not well. Very critical. A little bit afraid, and a little bit just not falling at Jesus' feet, that's for sure. So Jairus coming to Jesus and falling at Jesus' feet was a very big risk. Last week, somebody else fell at Jesus' feet 2 weeks ago, the man in the tombs, right? And now Jairus. Who is Jairus? Well, he's a synagogue leader, likely a Pharisee, but the primary identity we have of Jairus today, he's a father. Jairus is a father, and his daughter is in trouble, and that's all that matters to him. So he's taking a risk. Verse 23. He pleaded earnestly with Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed in around him. Please, my little daughter, please. Every parent here knows that feeling. When there's something wrong with your child, nothing else matters. And again, we have these crowds pressing in on him. Big contrast to what happened across the Sea of Galilee 2 weeks ago. They said, please leave, please leave, please leave. And here, welcome, welcome, here comes the crowd. Jairus' need is acute. This is an emergency. There's no time to think about it. He needs Jesus to come now. Nothing else matters.
And yet, there comes an interruption. Just as they are on their way, walking to Jairus' house, a surprise comes along. Let's pick up in verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of growing better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So who is this woman? In contrast to Jairus, she is unnamed in the narrative. She's not seen as important. She wouldn't have had status. Due to her constant bleeding, she would have been marginalized, cast out of society. We don't know how old she is, but for 12 years, she has been suffering. For 12 years, she's been considered ritually unclean, unable to be near people, likely cast out from her family. Makes you wonder, how did she get by? What did she live on? How had these doctors tried to heal her? 12 years. Thinking back to June of 2012, what were the things back then that were stressing you out? What were the things that were heavy on your mind and your heart? For some of us, those things are still present. Those things are still a source of pain today. For others of us, in retrospect, they seem smaller. Maybe we've seen provision, we've seen healing. 12 years is a long time. This woman probably thought she would try one more experiment. She heard about this man who was drawing crowds, who was healing people. So she thought, maybe I'll just go without a big fuss. I'll just go behind him in the crowd, and if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And it worked. She felt the healing at once. And how does Jesus respond? In verse 30, at once, Jesus realized that the power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?"
Are you kind of walking down the road with Jesus, right? He's in a hurry, and there's crowds pressing in on him, and they're trying to get to Jairus' house as fast as possible. And there's this momentum, right? It's like he's walking with a wave, and then he stops. What kind of dominoes are happening in the crowd? Who got tripped up? And he says, "Who touched my clothes?" Really? Have you ever been at Yankee Stadium trying to get out of it? Who touched me? Verse 31, the disciples, "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answers, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Can you see it? This is an emergency. And Jesus stops. He turns around. So what about this important guy, this leader in the synagogue? So what about this little girl who's waiting for me? Somebody touched me. You hear the exasperation in the disciples' voice? Come on, could have been anywhere, anyone. Also, this guy's kind of important that you're trying to help right now. It could really benefit our ministry if his daughter gets healed. Let's go. Let's go. You can almost hear it. But he keeps looking around. He's not having it. How's Jairus feeling right now? This man is probably not used to being put off. Probably not used to waiting for people to respond to him. Probably not used to being sidelined. And how is the woman feeling right now? She thought that she would just sneak in the back, grab a quick touch of his cloak, and get out of there.
But now Jesus is saying, "Who touched me?" And he kept looking for her. She's always been on the margins. She's always been invisible, unseen, unheard, unclean. And now the one in the center of it all is looking for her. Perhaps she thought she could get her healing and go, a drive-through healing, if you will. She came for the healing, but Jesus, it seems, wouldn't let her leave without relationship, without seeing her, hearing her, knowing her. Verse 33, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole story. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. So this woman, who has been isolated, marginalized, and not permitted to be in community, is spoken to by Jesus. It's likely that her bleeding was related to menstruation, which would have an extra level of stigma attached to it in that society. Makes you wonder, when's the last time she told her story? When's the last time someone listened to her? Except the doctors who took all her money and left her worse. I wonder how long Jesus stood there listening to her. It says she told him the whole story. 12 years of suffering probably would have taken a long time. And at the end, Jesus says to her, daughter. He calls her daughter. This is one of 2 times in the Bible that Jesus calls someone daughter. And what a word for us on this Father's Day. We know Father's Day can be a day of joy and celebration, and also can be a painful day for those grieving the loss of a father, for those with complex and painful relationships with a father. And here Jesus calls her daughter. Jesus calls us daughter, son, invites us to be part of his family. God reparents us with the compassionate, forgiving, all good love that only God can give us. And what does Jesus say to her? Go in peace. Be free from your suffering. What a word of hope. What a word of life for us.
Be freed from your suffering. That's just great. But if I'm Jairus, I'm a little upset right now. A woman with a chronic condition that would have still been there after he healed the daughter, is taking up a lot of time. I just wonder. Verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, daughter, be free. While he's speaking to this woman, then some people came up from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and they said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Yep, told you. What was Jairus feeling right now? Maybe he's thinking, doesn't he care? If the woman thought she was going to have a drive-through healing and just kind of get off anonymously, did Jairus think he had come for the VIP package? And he's not getting it. This is not what he expected. And I love verse 36. Jesus is talking to the woman. He's not a part of this other conversation that Jairus' friends are having with him. Your daughter is dead. It's too late. Your daughter is dead. Overhearing what they said, Jesus overhears this conversation. And then Jesus told him, not the crowd, Jesus told Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. I love it. Jesus is not listening to the voices of grief. He's speaking to the one who might have grief instead. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Don't be afraid. Just believe.
These words might sound familiar if you've been journeying with us through Mark and Exodus. Just a few weeks ago, we had the story of Jesus calming the wind and the waves. He's in the boat with his disciples, and he's sleeping in the middle of a storm. And his disciples say, "Don't you care, Jesus? Don't you care that we're drowning?" I imagine Jairus is thinking that in this moment. "Don't you care? Jesus, my daughter is dying at home. What are you doing?" And in both, Jesus says, "Peace, be still. Do not be afraid. Only believe." In Exodus a few weeks ago, when the Israelites are in the desert being chased by the Egyptians, they say to Moses, "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? The Egyptians who are known for their graves, maybe there wasn't enough. You had to bring us out here." And what does God say to his people? "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Peace. Don't be afraid. Only believe." We have this theme over and over and over again of Christ saying to us, "Don't be afraid. Only believe."
So Jesus turns to Jairus after this interaction with the woman, and he says, "Don't be afraid. Only believe." And then in verse 37, I love it, he loses the crowd. "He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James." How did he ditch the crowd? And why would he cull the crowd? Is it because he doesn't want this to be about spectacle? He's not a traveling magician? Is it because there's a child involved? This is not a circus. Was he using this to teach his disciples? Was he respecting the house of grief that they were going to? He left the crowd behind, but as he's walking with the Father and the three disciples, he comes into another kind of spectacle. Verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. In this culture, at this time, when someone died, you hired professional mourners to come to the house. And they would wail and sing and carry on. I bet they heard this group of mourners a block away.
Yeah.
So they knew that something was happening when they were coming up. Verse 39, he went in and he said to the mourners, "Why all this commotion and wailing? This child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. I love that they laughed at him. Well, I don't love it, but I do. Because those of us who've been in intense periods of grief, where we're just so raw, aren't those the times where we really need to laugh? And sometimes inappropriate humor carries the day. That's been my case this year on the death of my dad. We just need to laugh. And they laugh at him. It's like the disciples saying, "What do you mean, who touched you? Did you not see the crowds? What do you mean she's not dead?" After that, we read, he put them all out. I love that. Like he would have the authority. "All right, everybody out." And he took the child's father and the mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went into where the child was. The child was probably lying in bed. I can picture him sitting down on the bed. In verse 41, he took her by the hand, and he said to her, "Talita kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." I just love this verse. Those of you who've ever had littles, is there no greater joy than going into their room in the mornings before they're awake and looking at their little sweet innocent faces and sitting next to them and holding their hand and saying, "Hey little, hey sweet babu, it's time to get up." That's what he's saying to this little girl. He's so tender with her. It's like nothing to him. "Little one, time to get up." And he held her hand. I love that. He held her hand. Verse 42, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. And he gave them strict orders not to let anyone know about it. And he told them to give her something to eat. Of course she was hungry. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jesus has power over death. Every week we're in Mark, we start with the question, who is this man? And every week the picture gets a little bit more filled in, both for the people in the narrative and also for us. Jesus has power over death, power over sickness and disease. He has power and authority over the law, power over the waves and the wind, power over demons.
Yeah. Today in this passage, we've had Jesus at the center and a whole number of different characters and people as an individual surrounding Jesus. So as you think about the narrative we've read this morning, where do you place yourself? Where do you see yourself in this? Perhaps some of us relate to the disciple, following but a bit perplexed, a bit confused about what Jesus is up to. Maybe some of us relate to the woman, isolated, vulnerable, in need, and still holding on to a strand of hope.
Or maybe you relate to the father, so desperate for his daughter, but trusting and risking his own reputation to go to the feet of Jesus. Or maybe you relate to the mourners. You're in a place where it just hurts too much and you're cynical, and it makes you laugh to think that there might be more. We think this is a powerful enough story for each one of us to sit with. Like the sermon could be over right now. But each of us are going to share one takeaway about what God's love looks like through the prism of this passage. What does God's love look like through the prism of this passage?
So the two lenses we're going to use to look at this are first, the love of God through the lens of time, and how time is so very different in God's economy. And the second is how love is shown through listening. So time and listening.
Time. I've been thinking a lot about Jesus this week, living in this passage, in the context, and I started wondering about the daily schedule of Jesus. Like, how did he know when he woke up every morning what was on his agenda for the day? No Google Calendar, no watch reminding him where he's supposed to be. Like, did he just wake up and say, okay, God, whatever you want? Time in our culture is so different. And really, for the last 3 years or so, I've been having the same takeaway when I look at these passages. Here it is. You've heard me say it before. Jesus is never in a hurry. Jesus is never rushed. He is always present. Jesus has time. That's my takeaway. God has time, and Christ gives us time, and we don't have to worry about wasting God's time. How do we have a relationship with time in our culture, in my own life, in our lives? What do we do with time? We treat time like it's money, don't we? We spend time, we waste time, we save time, we use time, we maximize time, we budget time. We set aside family time, we set aside study time, quiet time, work time, screen time. Our lives are structured around this idea of time. We commodify it, and we make time transactional. I'll give you 5 minutes if you give me, right? I'll let you watch a show if you read a book first. That happens in our house a lot. Courtney, you introduced me to an article this week by a man named John Swinton, and he talks about time from the perspective of God. He writes this: time is a creature. Time is not something that has always been there, into which God slips creation like a foot in a slipper. There was a time when time was not. There was a time when time was not. And then there was a time when time was. Time is something that came into existence spontaneously when God was creating. It's a dimension of creation, and this is so important for us to even think about. Time is an aspect of God's relationship with the world. It's a gift from a loving creator. Time is best conceived as an aspect of God's love. The purpose of time is to facilitate and sustain love. Father's Day, anyone? purpose of time is to facilitate and sustain love. It's a creature born out of God's love, intended as the arena for the revelation of that love. So to watch Jesus in this passage, not in a hurry, using time not as a commodity, but as an instrument of love, shows us that time is not transactional. I think sometimes when I read this passage, I'm tempted to think that Jesus is stealing time from Jairus to heal the woman. That is not what is happening. Instead, Jesus is using time to listen to the woman because that's a part of her healing. He gives her time and he listens like a good father listens to his children.
Amen. Yeah, what does Jesus do with his time? He listens. Mm-hmm. He listens. In the middle of his schedule, when this seeming interruption comes, he takes the time to listen. Do we believe that Jesus listens to us too? That he listens to us not the way that we listen to our neighbor's very loud music at 2 o'clock in the morning? He doesn't tolerate us. He listens to us the way we hang on every note of our favorite song, the way we listen to news we've been longing to hear, the way we listen to a loved one speaking to us. Jesus listens because he loves. And the invitation of this passage is to receive God's gift of listening and to listen to him. We see in this passage in all of Mark that everything listens to Jesus. The wind and the waves listen to Jesus. The demons listen to Jesus. Sickness listens to Jesus. Even death listens to Jesus. Do we? Do we listen the same way that the wind and the waves do? What do we need to listen to Jesus say this morning? One side of listening is obedience, right? Obeying what Christ has for us. But the other side that we don't think about as often, perhaps, is listening to the words that Jesus speaks over us. And what are the words that Jesus speaks in this passage? Jesus says, "Go in peace and be freed of your suffering." Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He calls the woman daughter. He says, "Wake up and eat something." Why all this commotion? Who touched me? It's relationship. Relationship. Jesus listens to this woman's story. Jesus listens to us. And the invitation for us is to listen and receive the words that God is speaking to us, the words of truth about who we are and what it means to follow Jesus in this life. So what does the love of God look like in this passage? Christ has time for us. God has time for you. He's not too busy. And he listens. He listens. And as we close, we're going to recount for you all the words of Christ in this passage. And as we read them, I invite you to listen and just to pray in your spirit and say, "Lord, is there a word for me this morning? Is there one of these lines of Jesus' words that Christ has for you today to carry with you in this Sunday and throughout the week?" So perhaps Christ is saying to you this morning, "You're my daughter. You're my son, my beloved. Your faith has made you well."
Maybe he's saying, "Little one, it's time to get up."
Perhaps he's saying, "Go in peace and be free. Be free of your suffering."
Maybe he's saying, "Don't be afraid, only believe."